We got the brand new BetaFPV Meteor Air65 bind and fly. This features a new flight controller, which is really interesting. We're definitely gonna take a look at that, but we're not gonna waste any time. We're just gonna jump right into that flight footage and see how it does. Now, before we get too far into this, I do wanna say that this is a pre-production unit. This was sent to me from BetaFPV for review. And so what we have here might not actually be exactly what the final version is. In fact, it definitely won't be, as the flight controller is going to change just a little bit, but we're also getting a more updated version of that flight controller as well. We're gonna take a look at that after we see the flight footage that we have here. But the first thing I wanted to do is just take this thing out of the box and see how it flies without modifying anything. And so that's what we have right now. It's going to be a really good baseline to know what to expect. Now, obviously there are a couple things that I had to change. So I had to put my bind phrase in so I could bind it up. And then I changed the modes, that way it would work with my radio and I would be able to arm the quad and take off. And then the other thing is that I changed the rates to be what I'm comfortable with. So by default, it was a little bit high. I suggested that they back that down a little bit. Final version may or may not include that, but I did go ahead and change that on this one to reflect my personal taste. And I have to say, I'm actually pretty impressed with how well it flew. It's definitely very lightweight. We're gonna take a look at that in a bit as well. And other than the rates being a little bit high out of the box, the only other complaint that I really have is that it comes on the lowest camera angle setting out of the box. And with how powerful these motors are, it looks like they're 27,000 kV, but it's just a lot of power to have with a low camera angle. And so you'll kind of notice that in some of my faster flying, I'm starting to look at the ground a little bit more. And that's just because when you have motors that are this powerful and you're on a racetrack and you're flying, you really want to be pitched forward. You really want to be going as fast as you can. So I find that if you are using a lower camera angle like this came out of the box, and you have this powerful of motors, it can just be really difficult to control your throttle. And so I think either you would want to probably put like a throttle limit on it if you aren't comfortable with higher camera angles, or if you are comfortable with higher angles and faster flying, then just go ahead and up the camera angle. It is an adjustable mount, so that's super easy to do, but it is just worth noting that out of the box, it is, in my opinion, a pretty low camera angle for a whoop that's meant for racing and has this powerful of motors on it. And that's feedback that I also gave them, so maybe in the final version they might just put a throttle limit on it by default, or maybe put it on a switch, or maybe they just ship it with a higher camera angle. But even if that's not something that changes, that's super easy to do on your end. It's just if you're a beginner and you don't know how these things affect your flight characteristics, you might not know to make those changes on your own. Overall though, so far, I really don't have any complaints with this thing. In terms of its flight performance, we're of course gonna take it to the bench, we're gonna break it down, we're gonna talk about the specifics of what I like, what I don't like, and also take it apart and get a better look at this brand new flight controller. Everything else on this build we have seen before. The flight controller is really the only thing that's brand new, and so of course that is what I am most interested in. This is the Whoop. I've already flown it at this point. You've already seen that footage, but we're gonna go ahead and take a deeper look at it now that we've actually put it through its paces. But before we do, I just wanted to show you this new box that they are shipping it in. And maybe I've just never bought a BetaFPV bind and fly before, so I'm not sure if this is anything new, but this is pretty sleek. And it's honestly a lot nicer than what I expected to get. And inside of the box, it came with this USB adapter. That's really important. I'm gonna show you why in a second. I also got some extra props and an extra canopy, but I'm not sure if that actually comes with the bind and fly or if they just sent that to me specifically to help me complete this review. But that's something that you may or may not have with your bind and fly. But overall, I am just really impressed with the unboxing experience here. It's not anything too crazy, but it is a lot nicer than what I expected. And that's a small thing, but it definitely stood out to me, so I figured it was worth pointing out. And it also comes with this foam inside of it, which is of course a perfect fit for the Whoop. So if you don't have a Whoop case and you just want something simple to carry your Whoop around, this box is actually pretty good for that as well. Now, as nice as that unboxing experience is, I obviously really primarily care about the Whoop, so let's go ahead and talk about that. Now, first and foremost, we do have this Air Canopy. This is something that I got earlier versions of, and I have to say I really didn't like it. I found it really difficult to actually get the camera angle that I wanted, because no matter how I positioned it, the camera angle was actually too high. But as you already know, on this build, I thought the camera angle was a little too low. So I'm not sure if I was doing something wrong with my earlier versions of the canopies or if they changed something. It doesn't look like I was doing anything different than what they have here, but they are managing to actually get lower camera angles now. So I'd imagine that this is actually going to be much more usable than what I initially thought. And it's also a pretty lightweight canopy. I think it's just about 0.6 grams. They do have a screw underneath of the camera. I don't know if you can see that there. That's going to add just a little tiny bit of weight, nothing too serious. However, I was noticing that the camera was able to actually rotate inside of the mount a decent bit. And so that is something that could potentially be concerning, because even with that screw in there, the camera can just get slightly crooked. And if you've ever flown with a crooked camera, you know that it's pretty impossible and not something you want to be doing. We also have the Meteor Air frame. This is the lightest Tiny Whoop frame on the market as of now, and probably for the foreseeable future. They did put the arrow in the back on this one, which is really funny and really interesting to me, because obviously the arrow does not go in the back, but that is demonstrating the power that Facebook has on influencing these companies, because these arguments over which way the arrow goes has gotten BetaFPV to conform to the arrow in the back crowd. And I feel like I should probably bring that up to them as my concerns, but at the same time, it's really not a big deal. I just think it's funny. Now, these obviously have the BetaFPV 702 motors. Specifically, these ones are the 702 SE, and that means that these are the ones with a bushing, not a bearing. And if you don't know the difference, the bushing is going to be lighter, but the bearing is in theory gonna fly better. However, it seems like the people who are using the BetaFPV 702 motors are preferring these bushing ones, the 702 SEs. And I think that in this specific case, I would also prefer the 702 personally, but I have not flown the bearing, so I can't say that for sure. But just in general with these 702 motors, I am kind of leaning towards team bushing. And so I kind of like the fact that they went with the bushing version on these. I'll also say that the bushing version is actually the lightest 702 on the market, I believe. Might be a little bit wrong on that, but I am pretty sure that it's just ever so slightly lighter than the Happy model motors. And I think that's probably why they went with them on this build, because they're really looking to make this Whoop as light as possible as a bind and fly. And of course, that means that the motors are direct soldered, so there's no motor plugs there. I'm not sure if a final version of this flight controller would come with motor plugs, and we are going to weigh this thing after we finish going through all of these other details. Now, the propellers, they are the GemFan 1219S. These are currently one of GemFan's newest offerings, if not their newest offering. These are a very popular racing propeller. In fact, I would say it's one of the top two ones that you would see top level pilots using. And so some pilots might prefer HQ, but I know a lot of pilots also prefer the gem fan, so either way, they made a really good choice with this propeller, and it's in line with what you would expect to see from top-level racing pilots. The camera is the CO3, and the CO3 is actually one of my favorite cameras on the market for whoops right now. I like the image that you get out of it, and I also like how light it is. It's one of the lighter cameras you can get. I think the field of view is just a little bit narrow for my taste, but in practice, that actually didn't really seem to bother me when I was flying it out on the track I had built. So maybe kind of a minor gripe, but it is something that I'm thinking about. And so that pretty much just leaves the flight controller to talk about now. Now, I will say that it came attached with this 180 degree BT2 adapter. BetaFPV released this a while ago. I don't know if you can see that. And that's because the racing pilots like to make these 180 degree adapters like this. It allows you to shorten the battery lead and still be able to plug it in. A shorter battery lead means less weight overall. That's something I do on a lot of my builds. You can see it here on this one. This one obviously isn't the BetaFPV 180 degree plug, but it is just a standard BT2 plug from BetaFPV that I soldered at 180 degrees. And this is a very, very common practice with racers. And so that's why BetaFPV made their own 180 degree BT2 plug. And that's a cool thought, but I think they missed the point with that a little bit. The reason why we do those 180 degree plugs is because we're trying to shave weight. It's not a convenience thing. It's not because we think it's cool or anything like that. It's purely about shaving weight. And with this specific plug, the actual connector itself weighs more. And so even if you do shorten the battery lead, your overall weight of this adapter still ends up being just as heavy as the standard BetaFPV battery leads. And in the case of this bind and fly specifically, the battery lead was actually a little bit longer than it had to be as well. And so you're still getting wasted weight on the wire. That's not like a huge deal because this bind and fly is still very lightweight, but it's just one of those things where I'm kind of thinking to myself, if you're going to do a 180 degree plug like this, to me that kind of communicates that you're trying to shave weight and that you're trying to make it as light as possible. And then so seeing a heavy plug like this and a wire that's not shortened, to me it just seems like they would have been better off ditching the 180 degree plug and instead using the normal plug. Now I am going to talk about the flight controller, but we keep talking about weight, so I figure now is probably a good time just to actually look at it and see how much it weighs. So that might be a little difficult to see, so we'll tip it up, but 17.3 is what I'm getting on the scale for this one. And that is a very competitive weight. This is a drone that you legitimately could unbox, make a couple changes to. You know, you might want to adjust that camera angle and the rates, but with just a couple changes, you legitimately could take this out to a race, and it is already competitive in terms of its flight performance, in terms of its weight, in terms of the propellers it's using. It's got the BT2 plug, of course, and so there's really not any reason why you couldn't actually take this to a race and be very competitive with it. In fact, this really isn't that far off in terms of its weight compared to what I know a lot of the top racers are actually running. There's a couple of the top racers that are frequently hitting something closer to like 16 grams or maybe even less. But for the most part, any pilot that is kind of a really good, but maybe not absolute top level pilot, a lot of times I see them sitting close to about that 17 gram mark. And for someone of my skill level, at least, I'm not really actually looking to get much lighter than that. So to me, I'm really happy with this weight. I think it's great. And I personally would absolutely take this to a race and have no problems using it. Now we got to talk about this flight controller though. What is going on with this thing? And probably one of the most interesting things is that if you look where the USB plug should be, you'll see that there is in fact not a USB plug there at all. They've replaced it with a 4-pin connector, and that's really all that you need to be able to connect to Betaflight and get all of the functionality of a USB. It's just not in the USB form factor. And so that's why they give you this adapter piece. It's got USB-C on one end, and then it's got that 4-pin plug on the other end. So you're able to go directly to your Whoop and then plug in USB-C right there, and then all of a sudden this thing connects to your computer just like you would expect it to. And for me personally, because I have several BetaFPV drones and this isn't the first one that they've put this connector on, I actually have 2 or 3 of these adapters laying around. And also, since I primarily fly Whoops, where all of the flight controllers typically are micro USB, the fact that this one is not micro USB, it's USB-C, what that means is that I actually can just leave the adapter on my USB-C cable and I never have to take it off, because if I'm not using one of these BetaFPV Whoops, I'm just using a different cable entirely. And so basically I just have my USB-C cable, which is permanently dedicated towards my BetaFPV Whoops. And I know some people might not like ditching the USB. For me, I think it's a great thing because it's weight savings, and when you're a racing pilot, that's really something that's important to you. Now, this version of the flight controller is 1 millimeter thick. I believe that the final version they're gonna do is gonna be 0.8 millimeters thick, so it's gonna be even lighter than this one. Once I get it in, we're gonna weigh that and see how much the 0.8 millimeter version weighs. Okay, so we got the new version of the flight controller. This one's almost identical to what's actually gonna be on the bind and fly. So they sent me this one to take a look at, and I'm gonna show you a couple things with it here. So first of all, as we open it up, you can see we get our VTX antenna, typical hardware, and then it comes with this 180-degree battery lead, which I already told you I'm not super a fan of. I would rather the normal one and then to hand make it into a 180-degree battery lead, but that's okay. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't actually come pre-soldered to the flight controller. So you would have to do that yourself if you bought just the flight controller and not the bind and fly. I'm guessing maybe because it's a review unit, that's why it's not soldered, and maybe the actual final product would come soldered. But in our case, that actually helps us out a bit, because that means that we will be able to weigh the flight controller. So we're going to be able to weigh this, no motor plugs or anything like that, because it just doesn't come with them. So we'll go ahead and put that on. And it's kind of hard to see there, but 2.929, so about 2.9 grams. That's going to be lighter than pretty much any flight controller out there, especially because since this one has the VTX built in, you're going to be adding on a receiver to this flight controller, not a VTX, and receivers are about half the weight of a VTX. So a receiver is typically going to be a little under 0.5 gram, and your VTX is going to be typically a little under 1 gram. So not only is the flight controller itself lighter than other options, but once you actually add on the receiver to it, compared to adding on a VTX to other flight controllers, you're probably going to come out about 0.5 gram lighter by using this flight controller with your builds compared to like the old BetaFPV flight controller. So that already is super enticing. But now we're going to take a look at just some of what's going on with this flight controller. So first of all, this version of the flight controller is 0.8 millimeters. The one that you saw the flight footage for, that was a 1 millimeter one. So this one is going to be a little bit lighter. Now, this specific review unit does have the BMI 270 gyro in it. However, BetaFPV has already confirmed that they are sticking with the decision to go with the 42688 gyro, which I think is actually probably a smart decision. I think that's actually a better gyro. And that's the gyro that was on the bind and fly along with the footage that you saw. And it was flying pretty amazing. So I think that is a good decision for them to stick with that one. So one thing that's really interesting about this flight controller, if I can get it to stay in focus, is that our actual processor here that we have is not an F4 processor. It's actually an STM32 G473, I believe. It's tough to see on camera there. But yeah, STM32 G4 processor. And the size of it is actually incredibly small. So for instance, we can compare here. This is the G4 processor, and this is an F411 processor. And they look to be just about the same size. When I asked BetaFPV why they went with the G4, they did list that this one has better processing power. And when I asked about support for this chip in Betaflight, they said that it's existed for a really long time. Now I will say that my contact at BetaFPV that I have is pretty new. My old contact no longer works there, and so they got a replacement for her. And the new one is still learning the job and still learning about FPV, and sometimes there's miscommunications and things that don't get communicated correctly. So I'm not actually 100% positive if Betaflight already has support for this chip. And the reason why I'm not positive is because for whatever reason, when they sent me this, they told me like I couldn't flash Betaflight on it or anything. I had to use their fork. But at the very least, it sounds like they're working with the Betaflight team to get support. That way you can flash Betaflight to this like normal. You shouldn't have to be downloading hexes from their website or anything like that. Should be able to flash it just like normal in Betaflight and not even know the difference. But the reason why I bring this up is because it may mean that you can only use like the latest versions of Betaflight. So maybe Betaflight 4.5 would support it, and if not, then maybe Betaflight 4.5.1 and then newer. So I don't know exactly what Betaflight support looks like for this at the moment, and so that's kind of the one stipulation, is that you might have to be running a new version of Betaflight in order to use this flight controller. And I would guess that that stuff would be worked out before this flight controller releases, and therefore by the time you're seeing this video. But it is worth noting that they managed to put a tiny little chip on here, and it apparently has more processing power while still being the same size as what we're used to, and Betaflight should be supporting it. And so if that's the case, I think what we're gonna see is a lot of the new flight controllers that come out in the future will probably be using this G473 chip, because it sounds like there's not really any downside to it. Maybe cost, but I don't know the price difference off the top of my head without looking it up. So yeah, I do think that we're probably going to see a lot more of this chip in the future, and it's cool to see that once again BetaFPV is kind of leading the way with those sorts of developments, because I'm not sure that I have seen any other flight controller use this processor, and the people I've talked to are definitely surprised to see that. We also have really big solder pads for the flight controller, so that's super nice. And we have some pads up top as well for the camera, I believe those are. And of course you have just the plug on top. We also have some solder pads on top here. And if you can't read that, these are actually TX1 or TX3 RX3 5V and ground. So this is probably where you're going to be soldering a receiver to. And yeah, if you didn't notice, that's TX3 and RX3, indicating that there are actually 3 Uarts on this thing, which is probably going to be a byproduct of the fact that we are now using this G437 processor instead of an STM32F411. Now, it's hard to read the silkscreen on this thing, but it looks like these 2 pads down here at the bottom right of the flight controller right here, it looks like these ones are also for your Uart. So I think this is Uart 1. And so that's probably going to indicate that the VTX itself is using Uart 2. And so it looks like we would actually have access to both Uart 1 and Uart 3 up here. VTX would be using Uart 2. So we probably won't see pads for that on here anywhere. But it's really difficult for me to know what all of these pads are without actually having a pinout, and I don't think that they have one of those available at the time of recording yet. Now, your motor pads do, by the way, have some edge soldering that you can do. Nothing on top, but again, on the bottom you have those huge pads, so that's not really an issue. And the biggest thing that's going to affect people, of course, is this USB plug, which is not a USB plug. I believe this is a JST connector that they have here, and so you have to plug in an adapter to be able to use this with your computer. They provide that adapter. That's not a big deal, at least not in my opinion. And so that's kind of your flight controller overview. Now, the main things that they're changing between this unit And the final unit is that they're swapping off of the BMI 270 gyro. And then interestingly enough, it's really difficult to see, but right here, this chip is an F3 processor, which they're using for their VTX, which is here. This is the chip that's been in shortage, and this is a power amplifier that's going to give you the ability to go up to your 400 milliwatts or whatever it does. But they're using an F3 processor here, which I've never really seen before, and that's basically just functioning as the brain of the VTX. On their old M03 VTX, it was a BB21 processor, which is the processor that you're typically going to see on your Whoop ESCs, interestingly enough. And when I asked BetaFPV about this, they told me that the final version would be swapping out this F3 for a BB21 again, and that's because the BB21 is actually smaller than this F3 processor. So as far as I know, the only differences between this flight controller and the new flight controller are the BB21 processor, so hopefully the VTX performs as good on the final version as it is here, because they are changing that a little bit. And then the other thing, again, is that gyro. And we've already used the 42688 gyro on the bind and fly. That's what you saw footage from. It felt amazing. And so I don't really expect any issues there. That should end up flying perfectly fine. It is worth noting, though, that both this flight controller as well as the initial one that they sent me on the bind and fly, neither of them have a receiver built in. You have to add your own receiver. Again, that's what these pads on top here are for. And that's okay. I think that's my preference because, again, even adding that receiver, your weight is still going to be so much lower than what it's been with the previous best flight controllers, about half a gram lighter, and you have the benefit of having an external receiver, which typically is going to be a lot more reliable. And so they said that this version with the external receiver, that's what comes on the bind and flies. They are eventually going to sell a version that has an internal receiver where you don't have to add your own, so it'll be a 5-in-1. They are planning on selling that, but that's not going to be on the bind and fly. And as far as I know, there aren't any people right now that have it for review, because the other reviewers that I've talked to, they said all others had external receiver. So I think they're probably going to be a little bit more careful about putting out the internal receiver version, just because their old flight controllers have had a lot of issues with the internal receivers. But it does sound like they are planning on eventually releasing that, but I am not going to be able to speak to how well that one's going to do. So should you buy this bind and fly? Well, there's a couple things that I'll say. So first of all, I don't think it's quite as good as what you can get with a custom build. And if you want to know exactly how I would do a custom build, that video is coming soon. However, I think that this is very, very, very close to what you're going to be able to get performance-wise out of a custom build, at least one that most people are doing. And I'll say that I have let a couple people fly this bind and fly, and it seems like it's pretty much unanimously agreed that this is just hands down the best bind and fly that most people have ever flown. It's definitely the best bind and fly that I've ever flown, like from a flight performance perspective. It's a lot better than what I expected to get. And on top of that, it's coming in at only $95, I believe, which is actually less expensive than what you're seeing most bind and flies. Even after inflation, like a couple years ago, you weren't getting a lot of bind and flies that cheap. So this is quite a competitively priced drone. If you're going to be doing a custom build, your price is probably going to be closer to $140, $150. So that's a lot of savings over a custom build, and you're not going to have to put any work into actually building this thing. You don't have to know anything about how to tune it. You will need to know a little bit about how to set up the modes and stuff just to match what your radio is, but pretty much you don't really have to do anything with this, and you're paying a lot less money, and your performance that you're getting out of it is very, 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 very close to what you're getting out of a custom build. So I don't have the freestyle version. This is all about the race version. But if you're looking to race and you're looking for a quad that you can just pick up really cheap, I do think that this is probably going to be a great choice for you. And I think it's probably one of the highest value bind and flies that may have ever existed. So my only concern that I have with it is the VTX. I didn't have any problems with this one, but again, they are changing a couple things for the final version, and integrated VTXs always kind of put me on edge. But I think that if any flight controller has that integrated VTX done correctly, I think it's probably this one. So I would definitely recommend this bind and fly. And if you're just looking for the flight controller, that's going to be coming to the store very, very soon. I'm expecting to be the first one to actually carry it because I've already placed my order. And so if you are in the US and you're looking to get this flight controller as soon as possible, check the link in the description because I think that's going to be the fastest way that you're going to be able to get it.